This event had made at the time a deep impression on my mind, as well as on that of the inhabitants of Paris. I perhaps had felt it still more forcibly on account of the principles of my childhood, the habits and connections of my younger days, and the line of my political opinions, and I was at that time far from having got the better of this feeling. That first impression had still remained in all its force, and my ideas on this point were such that I should certainly not have dared to pronounce the name of the prince in the presence of the emperor. It would have seemed to me to convey the idea of a reproach. I carried the feeling so far that the first time I heard him pronounce the name himself, I turned red with embarrassment. Fortunately, I was walking behind him in a narrow path, otherwise he would certainly have observed my confusion. Yet, notwithstanding all these previous dispositions on my part, the first time the emperor developed this affair in all its general bearings, its details, and circumstances, when I heard him expose his various motives, with that conciseness, brilliancy, and power of persuasion which form the characteristics of his logic, I must confess the affair seemed to wear a new aspect. When he had ceased to speak, I remained surprised, absorbed in thought. I silently called to mind my former objections. I was angry with myself for having little or nothing to answer at this moment, and I was obliged to confess internally that I found myself stronger in feelings than in arguments or solid objections. The emperor often resumed this subject, which gave me an opportunity of observing in him some characteristic shades very strongly marked. I have on those occasions most distinctly and frequently seen in him the private man struggling against the public character, and the natural feelings of his heart contending against those which were suggested by his pride and the dignity of his station. In the unreserved moments of familiar intercourse, he showed himself not indifferent to the fate of the unfortunate prince, but if his conversation had reference to public concerns, it was altogether quite a different thing. One day, having spoken to me of the youth and the untimely end of this ill-fated prince, he concluded by saying, and I have since learned, my dear Lescazes, that he was favorable to me. I have been assured that he used to speak of me with some degree of admiration. Such is the retributive justice in this world. These last words were pronounced with such an expression. Every feature of his face was so much in harmony with that expression that I have no doubt that if the individual whom Napoleon pitied had been at that moment in his power, he would have been eagerly forgiven, whatever his acts or intentions might have been. This is no doubt a sentiment expressed in an unguarded moment in which I had, as it were, taken him by surprise, and I do not suppose that many persons have found themselves similarly placed. This delicate subject was too sensibly connected with Napoleon's pride and the peculiar cast of his mind to allow him to be lavish in his expressions of such feelings, and he therefore varied his arguments and his words on the subject as the circle of his hearers increased. We have just seen how he expressed himself in the confidence of a private conversation. His language was even different when we were all assembled together. The affair, he would then say, might have occasioned him some regret, but he had not given rise to any remorse, nor even to any scruples. But when there were any strangers present, he would pronounce that the prince had deserved his fate. The emperor used to consider this affair under two very distinct aspects, with reference to the common law, or the established rules of justice, and with reference to the law of nature, or acts of violence. With us, he would willingly argue the matter, and generally on the principles of common law, and he seemed to condescend to do so on account of the familiarity that existed between us, or his superiority over us. He generally concluded these conversations by observing that he might possibly be reproached with severity, but that he could not be accused of any violation of justice, because notwithstanding all that calumny and falsehood had invented on the subject, all the forms required by law had been regularly observed and strictly attended to. In the presence of strangers, the emperor adopted a line of argument founded almost exclusively on the law of nature and the state politics. It was visible that it would have been too painful for him so far to lower himself with them as to insist much on the principles of common law. To have done so would have appeared like an attempt to justify himself. If I had not had in my favor the laws of the country to punish the culprit, he would say to them, I should still have had the right of the law of nature to legitimately defend myself. The Duke and his party had constantly but one object in view, that of taking away my life. I was assailed on all sides and at every instant. Air guns, infernal machines, plots, ambuscades of every kind were resorted to for that purpose. At last I grew weary and took an opportunity of striking them with terror in their turn in London. I succeeded, and from that moment there was an end to all conspiracies. Who can blame me for having acted so? What? Blows threatening my existence are aimed at me day after day from a distance of 150 leagues. No power on earth, no tribunal can afford me redress, and I shall not be allowed to use the right of nature and return war for war. What man, unbiased by party feelings, possessing the smallest share of judgment and justice, can take upon himself to condemn me? On what side will he not throw blame, odium, and criminal accusations? Blood for blood, such is the natural, inevitable, and infallible law of retaliation. Woe to him who provokes it. Those who foment civil dissensions or excite political commotions expose themselves to become the victims of them. It would be a proof of imbecility or madness to imagine and pretend that a whole family should have the strange privilege to threaten my existence day after day without giving me the right of retaliation. They could not reasonably pretend to be above the law to destroy others and claim the benefit of it for their own preservation. The chances must be equal. I had never personally offended any of them. A great nation had chosen me to govern them. Almost all Europe had sanctioned their choice. My blood, after all, was not ditch water. It was time to place it on par with theirs. And what if I had carried retaliation further? I might have done it. The disposal of their destiny, the heads of every one of them, from the highest to the lowest, were more than once offered to me, but I rejected the offer with indignation. Not that I thought it would be unjust for me to consent to it in the situation to which they had reduced me, but I felt so powerful, I thought myself so secure, that I should have considered it a base and gratuitous act of cowardice. My great maxim has always been that in war, as well as in politics, every evil action, even if legal, can only be excused in case of absolute necessity. Whatever goes beyond that is criminal. It would have been ridiculous in those who violated so openly the law of nations to appeal to it themselves. The violation of the territory of Baden, which so much has been said, is entirely foreign to the main point of the question. The law of the inviolability of territory has not been devised for the benefit of the guilty, but merely for the preservation of the independence of nations and of the dignity of the sovereign. It was therefore for the Duke of Baden, and for him alone, to complain, and he did not. He yielded, no doubt, to violence and to the sentiment of his political inferiority. But even then, what has that to do with the merits of the plot and outrages which I had to complain of, and of which I had every right to be revenged? And he concluded that the real authors of the dreadful catastrophe, the persons who alone were responsible for it, were those who had favored and excited from abroad the plots formed against the life of the first consul. For, said he, either they had implicated the unfortunate prince in them, and had thus sealed his doom, or by neglecting to give him intimation of what was going forward, they had suffered him to slumber imprudently on the brink of a precipice, and to be so near the frontiers at the moment when so great a blow was going to be struck in the name and for the interest of his family. To us, in the intimacy of private conversation, the emperor would say that the blame in France might be ascribed to an excess of zeal in those who surrounded him, or to dark intrigues or private views that he had been precipitately urged on in this affair, that they had, as it were, taken his mind unawares, and that his measures had been hastened and their result anticipated. I was one day alone, said he. I recollect it well. I was taking my coffee, half seated on the table at which I had just dined, when sudden information is brought to me that a new conspiracy has been discovered. I am warmly urge to put an end to these enormities. They represent to me that it is time at last to give a lesson to those who have been day after day conspiring against my life, that this end can only be attained by shedding the blood of one of them, and that the Duc d'Enghien, who might now be convicted of forming part of this new conspiracy, had taken in the very act, should be that one. It was added that he had been seen at Strasbourg, that it was even believed that he had been in Paris, and that the plan was that he should enter France by the east at the moment of the explosion, whilst the Duc de Berry was disembarking in the west. I should tell you, observed the Emperor, that I did not even know precisely who the Duc d'Enghien was, the revolution having taken place when I was yet a very young man, and I never having been at court, and that I was quite in the dark as to where he was at that moment. Having been informed on those points, I exclaimed that if such were the case, the Duke ought to be arrested, and that orders should be given to that effect. Everything had been foreseen and prepared. The different orders were already drawn up. Nothing remained to be done but to sign them, and the fate of the young prince was thus decided. He had been residing for some time past at a distance of about 3 leagues from the Rhine in the States of Bonn. Had I been sooner aware of this fact and of its importance, I should have taken umbrage at it, and should not have suffered the prince to remain so near the frontiers of France, and that circumstance, as it happened, would have saved his life. As for the assertions that were advanced at the time that I had been strenuously opposed in this affair, and that numerous solicitations had been made to me, they are utterly false, and were only invented to make me appear in a more odious light. The same thing may be said of the various motives that have been ascribed to me. These motives may have existed in the bosoms of those who acted an inferior part on this occasion. They may have guided them in their private views, but my conduct was influenced only by the nature of the fact itself and the energy of my disposition. Undoubtedly, if I had been informed in time of certain circumstances respecting the opinions of the prince and his dispositions, if above all I had seen the letter which he wrote to me, and which, God knows for what reason, was only delivered to me after his death, I should certainly have forgiven him. It was easy for us to perceive that these expressions of the emperor were dictated by his heart and by nature, and that they were only intended for us, for he would have felt himself much humbled had he supposed that anybody could think for a moment that he endeavored to shift the blame upon some other person, or that he condescended to justify himself. And this feeling was carried so far that when he was speaking to strangers or dictating on that subject for the public eye, he confined himself to saying that if he had seen the prince's letter, he should perhaps have forgiven him, on account of the great political advantages that he might have derived from so doing, and in tracing with his own hand his last thoughts, which he concludes will be recorded in the present age and reach posterity, he still pronounces on this subject, which he is aware will be considered the most delicate for his memory, that if he were again placed in the same situation, he should again act in the same manner. Such was the man, such the stamp of his mind, and the turn of his disposition. Let those who delight in searching the human heart in its innermost recesses to deduce consequences and draw conclusions now exercise ingenuity. I have supplied them with valuable materials. I have laid genuine documents before them. I will add another, and at last, which will not be the least worthy of notice. Napoleon one day said to me, with reference to the same subject, if I occasioned a general consternation by that melancholy event, what a universal feeling of horror would have been produced by another spectacle with which I might have surprised the world. I have frequently been offered the lives of those whose places I filled on the throne at the rate of 1,000,000 a head. They were seen to be my competitors, and it was supposed that I thirsted after their blood. But even if my disposition had been different from what it was, had I been formed to commit crimes, I should have repelled all thought of the crime thus proposed to me, as seeming altogether gratuitous. I was then so powerful, so firmly seated, and they seemed so little to be feared. Revert to the period of Tilsit and Wagram, to my marriage with Marie Louisa, to the state and attitude of Europe. However, in the midst of the crisis of the affair of George of Pichegru, when I was assailed by murderers, the moment was thought favorable to tempt me, and the offer was renewed, having for its object the individual whom public opinion in England, as well as in France, pointed out as the chief mover of all these horrible conspiracies. I was in Bologna where the bearer of these offers arrived. I took it into my head to ascertain personally the truth and the nature of the proposal. I ordered him to be brought before me. Well, sir, said I, when he appeared. Yes, First Consul, we will give him up to you for 1 million. Sir, I will give you 2 millions, but on condition that you will bring him alive. Ah, that I cannot promise, said the man, hesitating and much concerted by the tone of my voice and the expression of my looks at that moment. Do you then take me for a mere assassin? No, sir, that though I may think it necessary to inflict a punishment or make a great example, I am not disposed to encourage the perfidy of an ambuscade, and I drove him from my presence. Indeed, his mere presence was already too great a contamination. From the 21st to the 24th, I had remained with the Emperor the preceding day as late as 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. On returning to my own apartment, I found that I had had a visit paid me during my absence by a person who had become tired of waiting for me. That visit, which my son had received, and which prudence obliged me to insert in my journal at the time under the veil of mystery, may and shall now be fully explained. The visit was neither more nor less than the mysterious reappearance of the servant whom Sir Hudson Lowe had taken from me, and who, favored by the darkness of the night, and his knowledge of the localities of the island, had surmounted every obstacle, avoided sentinels, and scaled precipices to come and see me, in order to tell me that, having got a situation with a person who was going to set off for London in a very few days, he came to offer me his services without reserve. He had waited for me in my own apartment for a considerable time, and seeing that I did not return from the Empress, he had gone away, fearing lest he should be caught. But he promised to return under pretense of visiting his sister, who was employed in our household, or by having recourse to the same means he had just resorted to. The next day, I immediately communicated my good fortune to the Emperor, who appeared much pleased at the intelligence, and to attach some value to the circumstance. I was very warm on the subject. I strenuously urged that we had already been here above a year without having taken one single step towards the prospect of better days. On the contrary, we were every day more and more restricted, ill-used, and tormented. We were lost in the universe. Europe was ignorant of our real situation. It behooved us to make it known. Day after day, newspapers showed us the veil of imposture which had been thrown over us, and the impudent and disgusting falsehoods of which we were the objects. It was for us, I urged, to publish the truth. It would find its way to the ears of the sovereigns, to whom it was perhaps unknown. It would become known to the people, whose sympathy would be our last consolation, and whose indignation would at least revenge us upon our cruel persecutors. We immediately began to search amongst our records. The Emperor portioned them out, pointing out the share which each of us was to take, in order to transcribe them with greater dispatch. The day, however, passed without anything being done on the subject. The next day, Friday, as soon as I saw the Emperor, I took the liberty of reminding him of our plans of the preceding day. But he now appeared to think less of the matter, and ended the conversation by saying, "We must see." This day passed like the preceding. I was on thorns. At night, as if to add to my impatience, my servant came again and renewed the unreserved offer of his services. I told him I should take advantage of them, and that he might act without scruple, as I should not involve him in any criminality or danger. To this he replied that he did not care about that, and that he would take charge of anything I might wish to give him, observing only that he would call for it without fail the day after the next Sunday, which would in all probability be the eve of his sailing. The next day, Saturday, as soon as I saw the Emperor, I hastened to communicate to him what I had heard from the servant, dwelling upon the circumstance of our having only 24 hours more. But the Emperor, with the utmost indifference, turned the conversation to some other topic, totally foreign to my object. I was struck with surprise. I knew the Emperor's disposition, and I was perfectly satisfied that the indifference, the sort of absence of mind which he manifested at this moment, could not be the effect of chance, still less the result of caprice. But what then could his motives be? This idea haunted my mind the whole day, and rendered me melancholy and miserable. At night, the same sentiment which agitated my breast during the day prevented me from sleeping. I painfully recalled in my mind every circumstance connected with this affair, when suddenly a new light broke in upon me. What do I require the Emperor, thought I, that he should stoop to the execution of trifling details too much beneath him? No doubt, disgust and secret dissatisfaction have occasioned the silence which has caused my uneasiness. Ought we to be useless to him? Can we not serve him without afflicting him? And then several of his former observations came across my mind. Had I not informed him of the affair? Had he not approved of it? What more could I expect? Henceforth, it was for me to act, and I made up my mind in one instant. I resolved to proceed in the business without mentioning another word to him on the subject, and in order that it might remain more secret, I determined to keep it entirely to myself. Some months had now elapsed since I had succeeded in forwarding the celebrated letter in answer to Sir Hudson Lowe concerning the commissioners of the Allied Powers, and which was the only document that had been sent to Europe up to that period. The person who had kindly taken charge of it had brought me a large piece of satin, on part of which the letter had been written. Some was still left, and that was precisely what I wanted. Thus everything combined to urge me towards the precipice, down which I was about to fall. As soon as daylight appeared, I gave the remainder of the satin to my son, on whose discretion I could rely, and he spent the whole of the day in tracing upon it my letter to Prince Lucian. Night came, and faithful to his word, my young mulatto appeared. He had some knowledge of the business of the tailor. He sewed with his own hands the satin into his clothes and took his leave of me. I promised to give him some other things if he came to see me again before his departure, and wished him a pleasant voyage in case I should not see him again. Afterwards, I went to bed with a light heart and a feeling of satisfaction arising from the contemplation of a day well employed and marked by a fortunate event. I was far from thinking at that moment that I had just cut with my own hands the thread of my destiny at Longwood. Alas! It will soon be seen that 24 hours had not elapsed when, under pretense of my having written that letter, I was removed from Longwood, and my person and papers were in the power and at the entire disposal of the governor, Sir Hudson Lowe. And if I should now be asked how I could be so little on my guard and not suspect that possibly a snare might be laid for me, I should say that my servant had appeared to me honest, that I believed him to be faithful, and that I was still a stranger to all idea of instigating spies. A new invention, the honor of which the British ministers of that period made claim as their own, and which has since thriven so well on the continent.